The medieval world dazzles us with images of glittering crowns, magnificent gowns, and queens draped in jewels who were revered as symbols of beauty, piety, and grace. Yet, behind the towering castle walls and heavy velvet curtains, life was far less glamorous. Queens, despite their regal appearances in public, lived in conditions that today would shock us as disgusting, unhygienic, and disturbingly grotesque. The reality of their private lives was nothing like the fairy tales we imagine. To understand their world, one must peel back the layers of legend and step into the hidden chambers where the stench of filth, sickness, and strange customs dominated their existence. These women may have ruled kingdoms, but they could not escape the crude realities of medieval life. Take the matter of hygiene, for instance. Today, the image of a queen invokes luxury baths filled with scented oils and attendants ready with silken towels. The truth, however, is that medieval queens rarely bathed. It was commonly believed that water carried disease, and submerging oneself in it could open the body's pores to deadly humors. At best, a queen might be sponged with linen cloths dipped in vinegar or rose water a few times a year. Some queens proudly claimed they had never taken a full bath in their lives. Their skin became caked with layers of dirt, their hair heavy with grease and crawling with lice. To mask the overpowering stench, they doused themselves with perfumes and powders. But the smell could never be fully concealed. In their private chambers, the air was thick, heavy, and suffocating, not with the fragrance of roses, but with the reek of sweat, unwashed flesh, and spoiled cosmetics. Their clothing added to the misery. Gowns were often sewn directly onto the body, making it difficult to change or wash them. Queens might wear the same undergarments for weeks, sometimes even months, until the fabric itself rotted against their skin. Fleas and vermin nested in the folds of their garments, feasting on their bodies while they slept. The regal appearance that glittered in courtly gatherings was in truth a facade stitched together over filth. When a queen lifted her skirts to move or sit, it was not uncommon for attendants to catch a waft of the putrid odors trapped beneath the layers of fabric. Behind the glamour of silks and jewels lay the harsh stench of neglect. Even their meals, which appeared grand and extravagant, brought their own horrors. Queens feasted upon roasted swans, gilded pies, and platters of spiced meats, but the kitchens were breeding grounds of contamination. Food was preserved poorly, often salted until it was nearly inedible, or cooked in rancid butter and lard. The lavish dishes that reached the royal tables were frequently crawling with maggots or hidden with mold, disguised under spices imported at great expense. Teeth rotted quickly in queens and kings alike, their mouths blackened with decay, and breath foul beyond imagination. After meals, they wiped greasy hands on the same gowns they would wear to bed, and bones and scraps of food piled beneath the tables where dogs and rats fought for the remains. Queens draped in finery presided over banquets where filth and vermin thrived. The management of bodily functions was even more shocking. Castles were not equipped with the luxuries of modern plumbing. Instead, queens relieved themselves in chamber pots kept close to their beds, and these were emptied by servants only once or twice a day. Some queens even used corners of their rooms to relieve themselves in haste. The stench of urine and feces clung to the chambers, soaked into the straw mats and rushes scattered across the floor. These rushes, meant to soften the cold stone ground, quickly became saturated with food scraps, spittle, vomit, and human waste. Rarely replaced, they festered with vermin, crawling with insects, and reeking so badly that visitors often gagged upon entering the royal apartments. Yet queens, who were expected to embody grace and majesty, lived and slept amidst this filth. The rushes themselves tell a horrifying tale. Straw mixed with herbs like lavender or mint was meant to disguise the stench, but the effect was weak at best. Over time, they turned black with filth, creating a damp carpet of disease. Rats scuttled beneath the beds, feeding on the waste that fell between the cracks of the wooden boards. Fleas infested the bedding and gnawed at the skin of even the highest-born queens. It is said that one queen awoke to find blood on her sheets, not from her own body, but from the countless fleas that had feasted on her as she slept. No amount of wealth or jewels could shield them from this crawling torment. When it came to their health, medieval queens suffered ailments that today seem both grotesque and preventable. With no proper medical knowledge, they endured parasites, infections, and diseases that left their bodies swollen, blistered, and foul-smelling. Some queens struggled with chronic halitosis so severe that courtiers avoided speaking too closely with them. Others were plagued by rotting teeth and gums that bled constantly, their once beautiful smiles transformed into hideous displays of decay. Skin diseases left queens covered in sores, and the heavy makeup they wore, thick with lead and arsenic, only worsened their conditions. To cover these blemishes, they applied even more paint, creating a grotesque mask that cracked and smelled as it mingled with sweat. And then there was the horror of menstruation, a natural process made unbearable by medieval ignorance. Queens had no sanitary products as we know them today. Instead, they relied on scraps of old cloth, moss, or even sheep's wool to absorb the blood. These makeshift rags were rarely washed properly and were often reused until they fell apart. The stench was overwhelming, and infections were common. Attendants sometimes refused to come near queens during these times, leaving them isolated in their chambers where they lay sweating and writhing in stained bedding. The shame and secrecy surrounding menstruation made it an even darker ordeal, cloaked in silence but obvious to all who lived within the foul-smelling walls of the castle. Childbirth was another nightmare that revealed just how disgusting royal life could be. Far from the sanitized hospitals of today, queens gave birth in rooms filled with sweating attendants, foul air, and primitive instruments. Midwives with unwashed hands probed and pulled, spreading infections that often killed both mother and child. The birthing chamber was drenched with blood, sweat, and excrement, and the stench lingered for days. Queens, even while writhing in agony, were expected to perform their duty to the realm by producing heirs. Many died young, their bodies ravaged by repeated pregnancies, their beauty destroyed by illness and exhaustion. The myth of radiant motherhood was, in truth, a grim spectacle of suffering and filth. Even intimacy carried revolting undertones. Kings and queens were expected to share beds in public ceremonies to prove their marriages were consummated. These beds, enormous and elaborately decorated, were crawling with fleas and lice, their sheets rarely washed. Sexual relations were often conducted with little regard for hygiene. Kings who went weeks without bathing would lie with their queens, their bodies slick with sweat and filth. Queens, equally unwashed, endured these encounters, sometimes out of duty, sometimes under duress. The act left behind soiled sheets and a stench that servants quietly removed at dawn, only for the cycle to repeat again. Visitors to the royal court often left behind accounts that shattered the illusion of elegance. Chronicles describe the overpowering odors that clung to queens, the lice that crawled visibly in their hair, and the layers of paint and perfume used in vain attempts to disguise the decay beneath. Even the most admired queens were far from the paragons of beauty we imagine. Their portraits, carefully painted to exaggerate youth and grace, were lies that hid the grotesque truth of their private lives. Behind the golden crowns were women whose bodies were decaying from within, women who walked through gilded halls reeking of filth, parasites, and disease. To us today, this reality is shocking, even revolting. But for queens of the medieval world, it was simply life. Their power and wealth shielded them from many dangers, but it could not protect them from the filth that surrounded everyone in that age. They were symbols of majesty in public, but behind closed doors, they were prisoners. of disgust, their bodies in chambers crawling with the realities of a world that knew nothing of cleanliness. If the daily realities of medieval queens' lives already seem unbearable, the deeper one looks, the more shocking the picture becomes. What we see in illuminated manuscripts and romantic stories are visions of idealized queens, gliding through courts in perfumed robes, but reality smelled of sweat, blood, waste, and rot. These women, exalted as God's chosen consorts to kings, were forced to endure filth that today would disgust even the lowest servant. Their private lives were riddled with unspeakable practices, strange remedies, and habits that only amplified the stench of their existence. One of the most revolting aspects of their world was the medical care they received. Doctors of the time believed illness was caused by imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To cure queens, they resorted to practices such as bloodletting, where leeches clung to the skin, sucking until the floor was spattered with crimson. At times, physicians made queens drink concoctions made from ground-up insects, animal feces, or even powdered mummies stolen from Egyptian tombs. Their vomit and diarrhea polluted the chambers, and attendants struggled to keep the smell at bay, with handfuls of burning herbs. Rather than healing them, these treatments often worsened their suffering, leaving them pale, weak, and reeking of decay. Yet they endured it all, trapped by the ignorance of their age. The grotesque remedies did not end there. For skin diseases, queens were smeared with mixtures of rancid butter, pig's fat, and crushed worms. For dental pain, they chewed herbs, soaked in vinegar and urine, a stench that lingered on their breath for days. Infertility was treated with the application of animal dung to the womb, a procedure as revolting as it was useless. Queens, desperate to conceive heirs, allowed such foul substances to be applied to their bodies, suffering silently as their dignity was stripped away. To the court, they were symbols of fertility, but behind the closed doors of their chambers, they writhed in filth that would make us gag. Even death did not free them from disgusting rituals. When a queen died, her body was often embalmed crudely, if at all. Entrails were removed and sometimes stored in jars, while the rest of her body was stuffed with herbs to disguise the stench. Yet the preservation methods were so poor that the corpse would swell, ooze, and reek long before the funeral. Accounts describe bodies of queens bursting within their coffins, their rotting fluids seeping into church floors. Royal funerals may have looked grand to the mourners, but the air was thick with the stench of decay, and many fainted from the overpowering smell. Even in death, queens could not escape the filth that defined their lives. Their relationships with food and drink also painted a disgusting reality. Water was considered dangerous, so queens drank wine or ale daily, even at breakfast. This constant flow of alcohol made their breath sour and their bodies bloated. Constipation was a chronic issue, leaving queens groaning on their bedsides, their bowels blocked from rich, greasy feasts. To ease their suffering, they swallowed purgatives made of boiled herbs and animal bile, causing violent bouts of diarrhea that stained bedding and floors. Servants whispered of the foul messes they had to clean, though none dared speak openly for fear of punishment. The life of a queen, celebrated in public, was in truth filled with humiliating bodily failures that left her chambers revolting. Personal grooming was another horror show. Without proper tools, teeth were cleaned with twigs dipped in ash or crushed, bone leaving mouths bleeding and sore. Queens plucked their hairlines to appear more fashionable, sometimes using urine or vinegar to thin their locks. They powdered their faces with toxic lead, which cracked and peeled into flakes that stuck to their gowns and bedding. To dye their hair, they smeared it with mixtures of lye and pigeon droppings, leaving behind an odor so pungent that even courtiers commented on it. What we see in portraits as elegant beauty was, in life, a grotesque mask of filth and poison. Even the royal animals contributed to the disgusting environment. Cats, dogs, and even monkeys roamed freely through castles, leaving droppings on floors and sometimes on the queen's very beds. Birds were kept in chambers for amusement, their feathers and waste littering the rushes already thick with filth. Fleas jumped from animals to humans, making queens scratch until their skin was covered in sores. The glamorous image of a queen, gently stroking a lapdog, hides the reality that the same animal might have urinated on her gown minutes earlier. These creatures, adored as companions, filled the royal chambers with yet another layer of stench. The political nature of queenship added to the grotesque reality. Marriages were often arranged to cement alliances, and queens were shipped across seas to unfamiliar lands. During long journeys, they remained trapped in filthy ships that stank of vomit, seawater, and rotting provisions. Seasickness left them retching constantly, their hair tangled and clothes stained. When they arrived, they were expected to dazzle with beauty and grace, though their bodies reeked of sickness and their skin was caked with salt and filth. Behind the triumphal processions and trumpets lay women utterly exhausted, carrying lice and parasites into their new courts. The treatment of miscarriages and stillbirths was another revolting aspect of their existence. Queens were expected to produce heirs, and failure was seen as weakness or even sin. Miscarried fetuses were often hastily buried within castle grounds, sometimes not buried at all, left to rot in shallow earth where dogs dug them up. Queens, broken by grief, were not spared the filth of these moments. They lay in blood-soaked sheets for days, unwashed, weak, and reeking, while whispers of their failure echoed through the halls. Their chambers became places of death rather than life, and yet, within weeks, they were forced again into their duty, enduring the disgusting cycle anew. What makes this all the more shocking is the contrast between image and reality. Publicly, queens were painted as heavenly figures, embodiments of virtue and beauty, blessed by God. They paraded in golden gowns, perfumed with rare oils, dazzling their subjects with jewels that sparkled in the torchlight. But those jewels hung on bodies crawling with lice, covered in sores and steeped in stench. The grandeur of their public lives was a mask, hiding private realities so revolting that even servants struggled to endure them. The psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine being adored as the jewel of a kingdom while privately battling rot in your teeth, pus-filled sores on your skin, and a body that stank no matter how much perfume you poured on it. Imagine ruling over banquets, filled with nobles, while secretly knowing that your chamber pot still sat full beside your bed, its stench seeping into your garments. Imagine smiling in portraits painted to immortalize your beauty, knowing the artist was carefully disguising the pockmarks, swollen gums, and yellowed teeth that made up your real face. Queens lived this contradiction daily, their very lives. A grotesque theater of appearances. Even their attempts at spirituality were marked by filth. Queens spent hours in chapels praying, yet the chapels themselves reeked of unwashed bodies crammed together. The stone floors were smeared with wax, spit, and even urine from worshippers too poor or lazy to use privies. Queens knelt in fine, gowns that dragged through dirt and waste, their jewels clinking softly as fleas bit at their ankles. Their prayers for salvation rose not in sweet incense, but in clouds of human stench, reminding us once again that medieval holiness was often wrapped in the foulest of realities. As centuries passed, small improvements came, but the essential grotesqueness of royal life remained. Queens continued to rot behind their masks of beauty, suffering in silence as the myths of their glory were carved into history. Their portraits deceived, their stories were sanitized, but their private lives were disgusting beyond imagination. These were not fairy tale figures living in sparkling castles, but women trapped in filth, forced to endure the revolting truths of a world that understood nothing of hygiene, medicine, or dignity. So when we picture medieval queens today, seated, Gracefully upon their thrones, we must remember the reality that history tried to hide. Behind the golden crowns and silk gowns, they were human beings living in chambers of stench, their bodies crawling with vermin, their mouths rotting with decay, their lives marked by filth from birth to death. Their power and majesty could not free them from the disgusting prisons of their age. In the end, the shocking truth is that the queens we imagine as glorious were among the filthiest, most revolting figures behind closed doors. Their beauty was an illusion, their grace a performance, and their lives a grotesque reminder that even those who ruled the world could not escape its stench.